Hey guys, I'm Josh,
And I'm David.
and we are two of the three writers of WebCamelot here to do a commentary on The Quest.
This text was actually one of the last things that got edited to this episode. It was a text that had been floating around, this idea that this was actually an actual historical discovery, but initially the show had started off a lot more just kind of in the moment, and we wound up ultimately feeling that we needed to really clarify that our concept is webcams in Camelot.
Yeah, believe it or not, this opening scene with Stan here was actually probably the hardest monologue to write for me for the whole show. It's because it was the first monologue. There was a lot riding on. There's a lot of pressure. We have to get across. It'd be very clear. This is a guy. He's living in Camelot. This is not a medieval reenactor in modern times. He's on a webcam and he's blogging. And so we needed, make it feel very medieval pretty early on. So there was a lot of pressure to sort of get this scene right. So actually, I wrote this episode backwards, and this was sort of the final monologue I wrestled with. And that mustache is real.
We're about to go to Harold the Herald, and another thing that sort of took a while to get through was to take all these characters, like pretty much all the characters started off as these one note, kind of like, it's a medieval person online. Initially, when we were working this out, it was a lot more of just kind of a satire on YouTube stuff or a spoof of internet personalities. So Harold, like his whole thing was he sat and read proclamations, and he had a bad feed, so his feed would mess up and he could never get through an actual proclamation, which is fine on the page, but it gets really boring when you start writing more than one episode. He didn't really come alive until we come up with the idea of like, no, he's a newscaster, he's on location, he takes us into this story.
A lot of the finding the characters too was sort of making sure we had a variety of energies and personality types, along with the obvious they all have different sort of medieval jobs and their different medieval archetypes. But it was important that we had, some people like Jeffrey are very angry, and some people like Colette are just very bored, and so Diggory was really important because he's one of the few very positive people on the show. He has a very clear goal of wanting to be a knight, and he's very enthusiastic about it.
To me, the thing that defines Diggory the most as a character is that he's the relatable guy of the show.
Yeah, he's meant to be empathetic. So that was kind of the point. And so when we were casting him, we were looking for a guy like Matthew here who could do that.
Damsel in distress? I overheard Sir Gawain mention something about a troll. That would be so cool!
He was actually one of the characters in the original pitch. I actually pitched this idea in film school. It was Diggory, Colette, Jeffrey, and Stan, so all the major players in this episode minus Harold. And it was meant to be like a 4-minute short film, so clearly I had no idea what a scope of a short film should be. And it was actually David's idea to turn it into a web series, and which was the correct idea. So it's cool, though, that a lot of the original elements ended up in this episode.
One of the most amazing things about the origin of Jeffrey to me was that Josh had managed to come up with the idea of an art critic troll living under a bridge without the concept of like him being an internet troll crossing his mind.
Welcome to Jeffrey's lair, a light in the dark ages, an oasis of culture, and the dry desert of mediocrity we commonly call Camelot. Enter, if you dare.
We stole that gag from Mr. Bean, the paper in the fist thing. Rowan Atkinson, baby.
This is where we actually start accelerating the plot. Like pretty much everything else has been just kind of people talking about themselves. And one of the things that we eventually figured out was that wasn't going to be enough to sustain the show, or at least not to sustain it in the way that we wanted it to work. We actually had to get people out there doing stuff, and we had to have conflict that was escalating, and all those sorts of like dramatic principles had to apply.
This was a really important moment in the evolution of Harold's character, too, because even once we put him on location and made him a reporter, it was like he was just there to tell us about the White Stag. By escalating sort of the annoyances around him and by making him go from sort of a guy taking himself too seriously to somebody who snaps, it sort of gives him an A to a B, so it makes him actually a dynamic character as opposed to just Captain Exposition.
Basically the thing that we had to make sure that we did with everybody in every scene was give them not just a kind of a little story, but like a reason that they would be talking, something that could happen to them while they were talking to the camera. Going back to sort of the running theme of let's find the real version, not the cartoon version, Colette was essentially, she obviously started out as a damsel in a tower and needing to be rescued by a knight and all that sort of stuff. And we couldn't quite figure out a way to make her interesting until Kayla auditioned and brought this sort of like weird, bored, creative frustration into the mix. And that really clarified a lot of things. And where this scene really works, I think, is in this moment right here, where she has a suitor approach her window and turns him down. And that's the character.
Daddy, wait, no!
And yes, Harold does kill her right after the cut.
I've sharpened his sword, polished his armor, packed our bags, and saddled the horses. The next time you see this, Squire...
Little known fact, the horse behind Diggory is completely computer generated. I'm kidding. But Fenwick on the right there, he's actually wasn't there. That's David playing that part, and he's blue screened in. So Matthew's reacting to nobody.
This was the scene when Josh and I were talking about this. This was the scene where I was like, oh, this now it's an episode. This happens.
Once again, there's just obvious things. It's like, oh yeah, there should be like a climax of the story. Everything should kind of come together. And so for this, especially with our format, the idea was let's have a couple characters run into each other, in the frame.
Actually, we'd had buffering jokes in various versions of the script in other places, but this one actually came from this just simply being the last frame of this piece of video and thinking it was a funny frame to hold for a second. It also reinforces the webcam concept a little bit.
Once we found a way to connect Stan, who's such a fringe character, to the White Stag story, and actually have a payoff for not only Stan's opening scene, but the White Stag itself, like no one's ever seen it, and we have to have it show up on camera, quote unquote, somehow. This moment was kind of I think this could actually work, guys.
I really like that we introduced Wiglaf in the credits before she actually becomes a character.